Okay, so in this next part, let's really build up a custom class so that we can look at these different New York Times articles. And the first thing that we'll really want to build is what we want to do is have some type of summary of the article. It includes, what's the genre of the article? What's maybe the lead paragraph, the abstract? Is there any multimedia associated with this article? And just kind of a generic summary that when we print out the class, will actually give us a pretty good summary of the article that we're looking at. So the way that we're going to do this is we'll build up a very, very simple class, and then we'll make that class more and more complex. But essentially, I'm going to call this class New York Article. So for every single article that I have, it's going to be of type, or eventually it's going to be of the type New York Article class, and it'll inherit directly from the generic Python object. So inside of the initialization for an article, all I really want is the article data. That is the JSON that is associated with that article. It should be essentially a dictionary. So if you remember, we accessed before that docs, so we went to response and docs was a list of all the articles. So I'd like to wrap each of those articles in this specific New York Times class, New York Times article class. So if you'll remember, the way that we did this was what we had was we had a list of articles, right? So docs had a list here, and one of the things in the list was things like a lead paragraph. That was one of the keys. And then inside of that, it actually had some text that had to do with the article itself. Don't know exactly how long it was. And then it had another key that was inside of it, which was things like, there's actually quite a few keys. One of them might be abstract, which will be slightly different than the lead paragraph, or it could be, it depends on who's writing the articles. And then it'll have some text that's associated with it as well. So what we'd really like to do is be able to, have a custom class, and then this dictionary ends, and then another article starts, which is a new dictionary, and it's got a lot of the same fields that are part of it, and then eventually I can end the list. So the first thing that we're going to want to access is we're going to want to hand off each of these pieces right here. This will be of type NY article right here, and then we could also hand off all the information for this, and this would be another instance of NY article, this class would. So all of these are going to be objects, and eventually we'll build up a set of functions for accessing the information in each side of these articles in a really intuitive way. So let's start by just creating this New York Times class where we give it the article data, which would be the JSON information, this dictionary that's associated with it. We want to hand that off to this class. And we're going to say self.data is equal to the article data. So we'll just simply save all of the data that's put into this class structure. And we'll also specifically define what keys are associated with this. And this is just a convenience function. We could always access this through the article data, but I'm just going to grab article data.keys and save them right here. So we know exactly what keys have been defined. Are we have a lead paragraph? Do we have abstract? What are the keys that are associated with this dictionary entry? And so the first thing we'll do is actually define a very simple getter. Right, so what we're going to find is we're going to say, we're going to define this function get, where the input to it takes a parameter. And that's basically going to be the key that we want to access through that parameter. And so we'll do, a couple of different error checking, but we'll say, if the parameter is in the keys, right, so if it's in self.keys, we're just going to return self.data at the parameter. If it's not inside of those keys, we're just going to return none. Not the keyword, we're just going to return completely none, right? Nothing. So we can create a list of all of the documents that we have, and then we'll create for the very first document, the 0th element for the JSON docs. I'm going to wrap them, okay, New York NY article at the 0, and I'm going to save it into article. And now when we call this article here as an instance, so when we call .get on that article, we can access anything that is inside of that. And if it's in the keys, it will display it out for us. So I'm going to call article.get the lead paragraph right here and print it out. And actually what we see, so the 0th element, it went in and got the lead paragraph. And this was much more intuitive syntax for being able to print this out. We just say article.get, oh, get the lead paragraph. That's pretty obvious what it is that we're trying to get, what we're trying to associate with that. Okay, well, what if we tried to access different information that was in there? So what if we tried to access a piece of information like, let me see, I'm trying to figure out, I think there's a headline, right? So what if we accessed headline right here and printed it out? Ah, well, here we can see that headline is actually a dictionary, right? So it returned the complete dictionary. So so article.get the headline, it says, oh, the key is kicker, and then on Olympics, right? The main headline is a defining moment for the Olympic Games, right? But there are all of these kind of sub headlines and content kickers that the New York Times uses that we might also want to access, right? What we can do is, first thing, let's put together a summary of this article, very basic summary of what the content is that's inside of it. So let's create a new class right here, NYArticle object. Nothing's gonna change for self.data, but now I am going to change my getter just slightly, right? So I'm gonna check if the parameter is in the keys that I have, but I'm also gonna say, oh, is that parameter not equal to none? Right? So if the parameter is not equal to none, then I'm just going to return data at the parameter. If there was nothing inside of there, I'm going to return an empty string. Okay, so that's just an update that we have right here. Rather than returning none, which would happen if we didn't return anything from a function, we're actually going to give it specific things to say, yes, it may have existed, but there's no text inside of it that we're going to return back to you. And now we're actually using that getter function, we can define a summary. Summary inclusion right here, this is a list of all of the things, all of the different keys that are part of this article that we want to include in the summary that we're going to display to people. And so essentially what I'm going to do here is for each of these keys right here, so snippet, lead paragraph, and abstract, I'm going to call self.get, and I'm going to grab each of those out of the article, right? And this is very succinct syntax. So what it'll do is create a list of the values for all of these things that are part of this dictionary, right? So for X in snippet, lead paragraph, and abstract, get them. If they didn't exist, this would be a safe thing. It would just return an empty string, and it will return to me a list. Now, interestingly, I can use the .join function to take all of that text and join the text together. And the way that I'm going to do that is I'm going to put an end line in between each of these. So the text that I get back will be snippet. It'll be the whatever value is inside the snippet, and then a new line, and then the lead paragraph, a new line, and the abstract, and another new line. And that's the way that it will join all of the values that are in this list. Right? So we'll do the exact same thing that we did before. We'll create an article, an instance of this NYArticle object from the 0th document, and then we'll call article.summary, right? And so let's see. Okay. So for this article, for article at the 0, we did have a snippet and we did have a lead paragraph. They end up being almost identical to one another, but that's not always the case. It looks like abstract. There was not an abstract. So abstract was equal to none. So it went ahead and returned just an empty string for us, right? We could do this with the first article. See what it does here. So in this one, we also had a snippet and an abstract, or sorry, a snippet and a lead paragraph that were really similar to one another. Let's see if we can find one that actually does have an abstract. Let's look at the very end element, the very last document. And okay, here's one that actually does have 3 inside of it. So in this one, we have a snippet and lead paragraph, which are almost identical to one another. And then we have an abstract, which is really, really similar, but it's slightly different text. So it's the writer of this article actually took the time to put together a slightly more succinct abstract to be able to put together what this article looked like. So now we have this really interesting summary that we can do for the articles. But it would be really, really nice if we could define something where, when we accessed article.get at the headline, would it be interesting if we could use the .get function to access, well, I don't just want headline, I also want headline, the main headline from this, and use this get function to kind of go into the different dictionaries that are part of this article and access each of the keys one after the other. And so let's actually do that. And let's do that in a way that it doesn't matter how many elements are in that list. I can go deeper and deeper into the hierarchy of this article and access the information that I want. And the way that I'm going to do that is by defining a recursion. Okay, so let's set up this such that we can access all the different elements of this article, but access all of the different elements using a recursion. And the way that we're going to do this is I'm going to leave the New York Times article. We're going to overwrite this class object, right? So the initialization and the get basically stay exactly the same. But I'm going to add this function called getRecurse, which is going to take the list of parameters that I want to access. And so it'll hierarchically access each of the parameters that are inside of the list. So I'm essentially giving it, okay, well, here's a dictionary, access this key of the dictionary. If that gives you another dictionary, access this key of that dictionary, and so on and so forth. And I want to do that infinitely many times because I have no idea how complicated some of these articles can get in the New York Times API. So I'm going to do that inside this getRecurse function. But let me show you the way that I'm going to use the getRecurse function before we actually go in and I actually call and use the function from it. So I'm going to create a list right here. And this is no longer just a list of the different keys that I want. It's actually a list of lists. Right? So each of these lists is, access the headline dictionary and the key main inside of that dictionary, or access the headline and print headline inside of the headline dictionary. Or I can access news desk, which will go into there and it'll grab all of the data that's associated with news desk and return it, right? So I don't have to use a list of 2 elements. I could use a list of 1 element or 3 elements or infinitely many, as long as I'm validly indexing into the New York Times article. So I'll take that list, and for each of the elements, each of these lists, I'm going to call self.getRecurse x right here. So x right here, when I call it the first time, will be headline and main. And then x will be headline and print headline, and so on and so forth until I get down to x being abstract. And then we'll do exactly what we did before, was join the values together. So let's look at this recursion function. And it's not too bad what's happening right here. The first thing that happens is we're going to check to see, so basically we're going to call this function recursion, which we've defined inside of the getRecurse function. And that's a really nice way. This recursion function is only available inside of this getRecursion function, or getRecurse function. And so that's a really way of kind of defining the scope. If I wanted to have more recursion functions, they could be called the exact same thing, but defined in another function, and it would never have a namespace conflict. It would never try to associate this recursion function with something outside of this function. So it's a really good way of namespacing and just saying that this recursion function is only used inside of this function. So we'll define it here. It takes 2 elements, data and parameters. So data is just whatever data I have left over, wherever I am in the recursion. And parameters is a list of the keys that I want to access inside of data. So when I first call this, I'm going to recall recursion, and I'm going to call self.data and all of the parameters. So I'm just giving everything that was sent in right here. So when I first call this very first recursion, the data that's entered right here is all of the data that's inside of the New York Times article right here, the whole thing. And the list that I'm entering, params, is equal to headline and main, right? So it's everything that's there, right? So if params right here is a list, headline and main, that's what gets passed in. So the first thing it'll do is say, is this an instance of a dictionary? And it turns out that yes, it is. Data right here is a dictionary. Right there. It says, okay, is the length of parameters greater than 0? and it'll look at this params right here, and it'll say, yes, params is greater than 0, right? It has a length of actually equal to 2. Okay, great. So let me look at params at the 0 right here, which is headline, that we have right here, and say, is that in the keys for this dictionary that's right here? And it turns out it is. Yeah, I've got a headline that's right here inside the dictionary. So what it'll do is say, great, what I want to do here is I want to redefine this. I'm going to say data now. I'm going to call the function itself. I'm going to call it within itself. I'm going to say, okay, data at the params 0. So what that does is now data is equal to that right there. This is my new params that I have right here. And I'm going to say, okay, I've accessed the headline params. Give me 1 to the end. So now when I do the second recursion, the list is only going to be a list with the value main inside of it. Right here, right? So this is my, for recursion 2, this is my data that I have right here inside this block up here. And this is my params now, right? This is equal to params inside the second recursion. So now, well, we're inside of this recursion function again. It's going to say, oh, okay, is data a dictionary? And it turns out that, yeah, data is a dictionary right here. This is equal to my data. It's a dictionary, and it's got main and print headline inside of it. And then it'll do the exact same type of thing right here. It'll say, oh, okay, well, params, yeah, it's greater than 0. It's got a greater than 0 length. And it's in the keys right here. So I've got main right here. It's inside of it. So it accesses, it calls recursion again. It says, okay, well, give me data at the parameters. So it's going to grab whatever is inside of the actual main function right here, right? So whatever is inside that right there, and it'll call recursion on it again. And now this is equal to data, and params will actually end up being just an empty list. There are no params anymore that it needs to access inside these dictionaries. And so now when we call recursion, data is a string, and params is an empty list. So it says, okay, is data a dictionary? No, it's not. So it goes to the next thing. Okay, is data equal to none? Well, no, data is actually, it's probably a string. It could be equal to none if there's nothing associated with it. If it's none, it just returns an empty string. Otherwise, it says, oh, is data a string? If it is, then we return data. And so now we go back through. So now we have all of this that was now associated with our data variable that we have right here. So now that's what we have. So now we've got this data. It's associated right here. It will return out of the the third recursion, and then it'll go past into the second recursion, and eventually it'll return all the way up, and it'll return from this recursion what was in data that happened right here. So that's a really, really easy way of going in and accessing headline at the main, and then we can access headline at the print headline, and so on and so forth, however many times we want to do it. So when we call self.getRecurse, we'll actually be able to grab all of the information that's associated with. So if I run this quickly, here's what we get. It's able to print out a really nice summary of the article that's at the very end. So I printed out the very last article because it has all of these inside of it, all of these sections, right? So it prints out the main headline and the print headline, the sections and subsections, was it came from, the snippet, the lead paragraph. But even if we chose an article that didn't have all of that information, we've written this recursion function such that it just returns empty if any of that doesn't exist. So if I access the very first article, well, yeah, some of these are actually just empty strings that get returned to us, and it doesn't crash, right? So, oh, sorry, this right here. So it was an empty string, the defining moment in the Olympics. And now, if we want to access each of the articles, so this JSON docs is a list of all of those New York Times articles. For each of those articles, we can just convert it into an instance of my NY article class, and now articles is a list of NY article classes, so that we can call for each element inside of articles, we can print out a.summary. If we do that here, we'll be printing out all of the information, all of the metadata, all the information, the text that we might be interested in, for each of the articles that came back from the New York Times API. And so it's a really succinct, a really easy way of getting all of those articles together. So next, let's look at how we can access not just the text, but images that are in each of those New York Times articles and maybe display them, maybe extract some features from them.